encourage your soul, enlighten your mind, and empower your faith. This is the Light Network.
Welcome to Inside the Scholar's Study, where we discuss all things concerning Scripture, faith, and scholarship. My name is Brad McNutt, and if you're ready, we're going to go inside the Scholar's Study, and we're going to pick up the discussion where we left it last week. We were looking at the numbers, the math on the New Testament manuscripts and some of those details, and so we're going to pick right back up where we left off and trying to nuance the discussion a little bit more, I think, was the emphasis, and make sure that we understand the details. Don't overstate a case. Obviously, know your audience, whatever you're trying to discuss, when generalities will work and when we need to be more specific. So,
yeah, let me mention one more resource too. I mentioned some books in past episodes, but here's a website. It's a blog, in fact, Evangelical Textual Criticism. I don't know, some blogspot.com or whatever. You'll find it if you just Google evangelical textual criticism. It is what the title of the blog says, but it is what am I trying to say? There are various authors. It's not just one guy's blog. It's several people have gone into it together. Peter Gurry, who has written a couple of the books that I've promoted on previous episodes of this season already, is one of the chief bloggers there. And so evangelical, that means they're conservative Christians. They're approaching it from the standpoint that the texts are inspired. The Bible is the inspired word of God. Textual criticism, they know what they're doing. They've got the data. They don't overstate a case. They really examine something. And so some of I'll be showing some charts that I ripped off of that website, Peter Gurry's. He put them up on the blog, and I'll show them here, and I want to give him credit. It's a good website, though. They update it pretty frequently, maybe once a week or so, with the latest developments in New Testament textual criticism. Every once in a while, there's something on the Old Testament, but mostly it's New Testament. All right, so let me go ahead and share my screen, and this takes us back to where we were last time. Talking about the Greek manuscripts, the different kinds of Greek manuscripts, and let me talk about these categories. So we've got 4 categories that scholars use: papyri, majuscules, minuscules, and lectionaries. And these are cited in this way in the critical apparatus to the Greek New Testament, whichever Greek New Testament you're using. So let's talk about the categories. We've got papyri. So that is written on papyrus. And the reason for making that its own category is because typically they're sort of earlier, or at least you can say our earliest manuscripts of the New Testament are written on papyrus. Not all like 135, and there we don't have 135. I mentioned these are the numbers you get from the website. We'll talk about those numbers when we go to the website here in a little bit, but we don't actually have 135 papyri. It's going to be less than that. I don't know exactly how many, let's say 120 or whatever. But the point is, not all 120 of our New Testament papyri are earlier than all other manuscripts. There's a great deal of overlap, and some of the papyri can go as late as, I think, we'll see a chart here in a minute that's showing us, but 6th, 7th, 8th century maybe. But our earliest manuscripts are also written on papyrus. So if you have a 2nd century or a 3rd century manuscript, it's probably going to be a papyrus manuscript. So that's the reason for sort of extracting that writing material and saying this is a category unto itself. The rest of the manuscripts are written on animal skin. Uh, some of the later manuscripts occasionally on paper. All right, so we've got papyri. By the way, the papyri are almost always majuscules as well. We talked last time about majuscules, that it's the capital letters is the way we think of it, the larger handwriting. Well, the papyri are also majuscules. It's just that because they're written on papyrus, they get their own category. The category called majuscules is going to be then written on animal skin, that is parchment or vellum. And so that category is according to the style of handwriting. Again, in a lot of cases, they're not going to be quite as early as the papyri, although there's a lot of overlap. But in most cases, they are going to be earlier than the minuscules, although there is also some overlap there. All right, and then the third category is minuscules. That's the smaller handwriting, the cursive handwriting, which picked up in about the 9th century and sort of replaced the majuscule handwriting pretty quickly thereafter. And that category goes up until the 15th, 16th centuries. And then there's a fourth category called lectionaries, and these are the ones that are not continuous text manuscripts. They don't have like a continuous text of a biblical book, like let's say the Gospel of John. They only have the portions of the Gospel of John that are appointed for reading in church. That's what a lectionary is for. And so it does have, a text of the Greek New Testament for those passages that are appointed for reading in church, but it doesn't have the entire text. So they get their own category, lectionaries. So those are the four different categories. They are all assigned numbers. This is from, like I talked about last week, the INTF, this institute in Munster, assigns these things numbers, these manuscripts numbers. So if it's a papyrus manuscript, the number always starts with a P. And then there's the number of the papyrus. Just, if we're up to 135, like the latest one is P135, well, then the next one is going to be P136. That's how that goes. The majuscules have a number. All the numbers of a majuscule starts with a 0. So again, this is cited in the Greek New Testament. If you look in an apparatus to a Greek New Testament and you see a manuscript that starts with a P, you know that that's a papyrus manuscript. If you see a manuscript that starts with a 0, you know that that's a majuscule manuscript. Mm-hmm. If you see a manuscript number that does not start with a 0, you know that it's a minuscule. And then if you see a lectionary it's going to have an L. So L, then a number. And so that tells you that it's a lectionary. Now, there are different ways of citing manuscripts as well. Sometimes letters like A, B, C, we've seen that before in the critical apparatus. Usually that's like famous manuscripts. I don't know if listeners have heard of this. We will talk about these manuscripts at some point this season, but like Codex Sinaiticus. It's a famous manuscript. It's cited by letter. The letter is Aleph, which is the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, which is, maybe in some ways annoying that we would assign it was the guy that discovered, or quote unquote discovered, the manuscript was this guy named Constantine von Tischendorf, and he was the one who assigned it this. He thought it was such an important manuscript that it needed this special letter early in, like the first letter of an alphabet. And so he went to Hebrew and assigned it the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, Aleph. Now, it also has a number. Codex Sinaiticus also has all the manuscripts have numbers. So it's also 01. That is the number assigned to it. But usually in a critical apparatus, you're not going to find Sinaiticus cited as 01. You're going to find it cited as Aleph. Okay, so some manuscripts have they all have numbers. Some manuscripts have letters, especially if they're famous manuscripts. All right, but let me get out of oh no, let me go ahead and look at these charts. And then we're going to go to the INTF website. So this is a chart I stole from Peter Gurry, who put it up on the Evangelical Textual Criticism website, that blog, and it gives us an idea of when our manuscripts are from. I mentioned last time that let's say we've got a total of like 5,300 manuscripts, but they're not all from the same time period. They're from vastly different time periods, and most of them are from about the year 1000 and later. And so this chart illustrates that pretty nicely. At the bottom, these are centuries. So this is first century, and you'll notice there are no manuscripts from the first century. And then we have the second century, and there are 4 papyrus manuscripts from the second century, as commonly dated, right? There might be some arguments about those dates, but as commonly dated, there are 4 papyrus manuscripts from the second century. From the third century, there are 47 papyrus manuscripts and 3 majuscule manuscripts. All right. And then the fourth century, you've still got more papyrus manuscripts than majuscule. But then in the fifth century, papyrus is on the way out. And you've got 11 papyrus and 51 majuscule, so written on animal skin. And then already in the fifth century, you've got 2 lectionaries. And then in the sixth century, again, 16 papyrus, 65 majuscule, 2 lectionaries. Anyway, it starts getting more and more manuscripts, and then it just takes off in like the 11th century. You've got 3 majuscule manuscripts in the 11th century, and then 443 minuscule manuscripts and 302 lectionaries. And then in the 12th century, you get more. In the 13th century, you get the most, 602, or at least you get the most minuscules, 602 minuscules in the 13th century and 414 lectionaries. And he's even got all the way down to the 18th century on here, 48 minuscules and what does that say? 78 lectionaries. I suppose this is all cataloged by the INTF that Gurry put on this chart, included manuscripts if it was cataloged by the INTF, meaning the INTF, I guess, has manuscripts as late as the 18th century cataloged as New Testament manuscripts. My understanding is that they do not catalog a manuscript as a New Testament manuscript that's, worth cataloging if they know that it is copied from a printed edition. So I guess these ones that are cataloged in the 18th century, either they weren't copied from a printed edition, or they don't know it. Maybe it just hasn't been proven that they were copied from a printed edition. So, I mean, that's pretty late, and you would think an 18th century manuscript that's like, what, 250 years ago, that doesn't seem like it would be all that valuable of a manuscript, but it gets counted as one of our manuscripts of the New Testament. Let me go on to this next chart, which has the same information, but just presented in a different way, where this one is where you can see more clearly what types of manuscripts predominated in which century. So in the second century, of course, papyrus dominated. You only have 4 of them, but all of them are papyrus. And then in the 5th century, the majuscules start to dominate more than papyri. And then in the 8th century, lectionaries really come on. And in the 9th century, you get more lectionaries than majuscules, and minuscules start to show up. And then definitely minuscules and lectionaries dominate the rest of the way. So it's something to think about, these, like, what century do these manuscripts come from? It's something to think about with regard to just thinking about what the value is of these 5,300 manuscripts. I mean, there are people, and probably some of our listeners are at least familiar with people who have different textual positions on how to think through. I'm talking about people who all believe that the Bible is inspired, but there are different ways of thinking through what do we do with all these manuscripts. There are some people, and this is not the position that is dominant in text critical circles, but there are some people who think that basically what we ought to do is just count up which manuscripts say this, how many manuscripts say this versus how many manuscripts say that, and we'll just go majority rules. There's actually a textual position called the majority text. And so you basically, that's what you do. You're not looking at which manuscripts are earlier or which manuscripts are later. The assumption is God preserves his word. And if he has preserved his word in more manuscripts in this way than in that way, then the more must be right. Well, most people who study the text of the New Testament don't come to that conclusion. They come to the conclusion that a manuscript from the 4th century is going to be much more valuable than a manuscript from the 14th century. And so even if we have 1,000, and we do, I mean, I'm looking at the chart and I see in the 12th century, there are more than 1,000 manuscripts. There are 518 lectionaries and there are 591 minuscules from the 12th century. So if we have 1,000 manuscripts from the 12th century, and we have, what do we have? About 40 from the 4th century, we've got 48 manuscripts. I think most textual scholars would take those 48 over the 1,000 from the 12th century. That's not to say that those 1,000 from the 12th century are completely worthless and ought to be trashed or ought not to be paid attention to at all. No, it doesn't mean that, but it does mean, the earlier the better. I think most people would say that. And so the way people think about this often is that manuscripts should be weighed rather than counted. A manuscript from the 4th century has more weight to it than a manuscript from the 14th century. All right. Now, we don't want to talk about the big three yet, but we want to go to this website. So the University of Munster has put up on the web the INTF website, and you can select whether you want it to be in German or in English. We'll take English, and we want to go to the databases and go to the short list online. So this is sort of like the official catalog. The short list online is the official catalog of New Testament manuscripts. And let's see what we can do. If we want to see basically how many papyri there are, you remember what I said about how the papyri are assigned a number. All the manuscripts are assigned a number, and the papyri are always assigned a number beginning with a P. So if you just go in here and you type in P, it will return all the manuscripts that start with a P. And if we scroll down to the bottom, we can see, okay, P141 is the most recent manuscript cataloged, and it is from the 3rd century, and there are 2 fragments of it. Okay, so, but we can also see, okay, P141, we get right here at the top that we have 141 results from our query. Our query is all manuscripts starting with P, and there are 141 results. We remember that that doesn't mean there are actually 141 papyri, and we can see like P14 is a good example because they say they have a note on here for P14 that they have removed that number because it is actually combined CP11. So presumably P14 is just a piece of P11 that people they didn't realize it at first, and now they realize that those are actually the same manuscript. Okay, so it's not going to give you'd have to look through it. Here's P58 that's been removed, combined with P33, P67. This is a well-known one, a Gospels manuscript that's combined with P64. People now realize it, and again, these I think I mentioned this last time that these are manuscripts that are housed in different libraries. So that led to the confusion as well, and it took some time to figure out, oh, that's the same manuscript. So there are several like that that are in red, and maybe even some more that are not in red but still shouldn't count for some reason. So you just got to check on that. But if we go, I'm just going to click on P1. And it says here that it's 3rd century and there are 2 fragments of it. Okay, and then when we click on it, we get even more that it's the name is P1, the language is Greek, and it's from the 3rd century. And what is the content? It is Matthew. E stands for evangelists, which means gospels. So if you see an E for the content, that means we're looking at the Gospels, and specifically they say Matthew. And then you get some more information. It's in Philadelphia. It has a little bit of Matthew. Matthew 1, what is that? 1 through 9 and 12. And then also 1:14 through 20 and 23. So I think basically it's got a little bit of Matthew chapter 1. And then besides that, you can get some bibliography about it. So all kinds of information you can get about P1. And then we click on a link here, and it takes us to the virtual manuscript room, and we can actually take a look at P1. And here it is. This is what it looks like. And there's even a transcription in the side. Somebody has come in here and transcribed the Greek text for us. I think there are some. Well, no, I don't know about this. I was about to say I think there are some where there's a translation as well, but no, I think I'm thinking of it. I'm thinking of a different website. But sometimes you'll get a transcription, not always, but sometimes at the INTF website, you'll get a transcription. You get sometimes you can see a picture of it. Not always. Sometimes the pictures are locked, but and then you can, I think, zoom in. Okay, that's zooming out. Let me see if I can figure out how to zoom in on it so you can take a close look at the letters. All right, so pretty neat. And then you can go to the other side of it. So it's written on 2 sides and the same fragment, just the other side, again with the transcription.
So would this have been like a leaf in a codex? Is that the assumption?
Yes, I mean
With the front and back?
do they actually? Yeah, I mean the fact that it's front and back makes you think it must be a codex. I am not the kind of person who should make those sorts of evaluations. It's not my expertise, is what I'm getting at. I do know that sometimes a scroll would be written on 2 sides, but it was very rare. So, yeah, my assumption is if I see something written on 2 sides, it was probably originally a codex. There are other ways, I think, of telling whether it's a codex that I don't know about. But I wonder if they tell us on the INTF website. I'm trying to see, is there anything here that says codex versus scroll. I don't see anything. One of the things, one of the interesting things about early Christian literature, though, is that it's mostly written on codices. I say that's interesting because, um, again, I don't want to overstate the case here, but if you're just looking at the manuscript evidence that we have, it looks like Christians in the second and third, fourth century really liked the codex. Just to remind everybody what a codex is, it's like a book where you can flip the pages, where the pages are bound together on one end so that you can flip them. It's like a normal book, like what we think of as a book. And you talk about a codex as opposed to a scroll. Well, pagan authors and Jewish authors in the second, third, fourth century oftentimes preferred a scroll to a codex. It took some time for the codex to catch on. If you were going to pick a group based on the manuscripts, which group early on was like a pioneer in the codex, it would be the Christians. Now, why is that? I mean, who knows? I do not know. There have been different guesses as to why Christians specifically preferred the codex. I think the codex started to take over certainly by the fourth and certainly by the fifth century, as far as like pagan literature and other kinds of literature where it's not just Christians, but the codex form is becoming dominant in all literature. But already in the second and third century, the codex is very popular among Christians as opposed to the scroll. And I'm relying here on Larry Hurtado, who has a book called Earliest Christian Artifacts. And he has a chapter in there about the development of the codex. And he points out, and other people have pointed this out as well, that for Christians, when you see a manuscript that is identifiably Christian, Christians are the ones who produced it. If it is a manuscript of what became Christian scripture, the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, it's even more likely to be on a codex versus if it's Christian literature that is not the New Testament, like let's say the Shepherd of Hermas or the Gospel of Thomas or something like that. The chances have grown that it's on a scroll for that. So it seems like the Christians preferred the codex over scrolls, especially when it came to their scriptures, which is, again, it's curious. There's probably something there. But as far as trying to explain that phenomenon, it's, difficult, and people are going to argue about it. So all that to come back to P1, it's a copy of Matthew. Again, is it a codex? Yes. I mean, I think almost certainly it's a codex, but just the fact that it's a Christian copy of Matthew also suggests that it's going to be a codex as opposed to a scroll. That's not to say that no copies of the New Testament are written on scrolls. There are some, but it's rare.
Right. I mean, in my mind, which I've never worked a scroll, so how would I know? But it seems like a codex would just be way easier to navigate than a scroll.
Yeah, I agree. It should be that way whether you're reading Homer or Matthew, though. So why would it be Christians who would figure that out as opposed to pagans? That's what's a little weird. But yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean, I'm very thankful we're not using scrolls. So although I guess it's come back in style with our phones, we talk about scrolling down and stuff like that. Yeah, right. Anyway,
at least we don't have to try and handle two hands and roll and fold.
Yeah, absolutely. What else do we want to do here? I don't know what. Let's see. I got lost track of time, so I'm not quite sure how long we need to go here, but
got about 5 or 10 more minutes.
Okay. So we've looked at papyri, and of course, I mean, like I say, I don't have special access to this or anything. This is open for everybody. You can come to the INTF website and play around with it, type in your P and look through all the papyri. Um, if you want to find majuscule manuscripts, I mentioned maybe last time or earlier in this episode that the numbers are all those numbers begin with a zero. So all you have to do is type in your zero and press return, and it will give you 329 results from manuscripts, and you are pretty much guaranteed all of these ought to be majuscule manuscripts. Now, from widely different times. So you can see, okay, we got a 4th century manuscript, that's Codex Sinaiticus 01. 02, that's Codex Alexandrinus from the 5th century. 03 is Codex Vaticanus from the 4th century. Those are the big three, by the way. Those are the big three manuscripts that are super famous. Some others are famous as well. 04, I think that's Codex Beze. Or no, 04 is Ephremi Rescriptus, I think. At any rate, you've got some other manuscripts here. You can see, I mean, 07 is from the 8th century. 09 is from the 9th century. What's the latest one we can find? This one, 044, is from the 9th or 10th century. So that's probably going to be about the latest one. You can see they've removed some of the numbers because they're combined with other manuscripts. So it's not, we got 329 results, but there's not actually 329 manuscripts. But let's see. A lot of them are from the, well, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th century. That's usually where you're going to get them. The 8th century, there's some. And all the way down, this one, 0320, is from the 10th century. The last one cataloged is 0326 from the 4th century. And so again, you can click on any of these manuscripts and see what other information they might have for you. This one is in Oxford at the Bodleian. It's the shelf number is P Oxy 5574. Well, P Oxy, well, that actually means it should be a papyrus, I think, since it's a P. So I'm not sure why it's not cataloged under the P. But Oxy is Oxyrhynchus. I think I mentioned this in a previous episode. That's that trash dump in Egypt that was discovered 130 years ago or something. Grenfell and Hunt. I forget their first names, but that's their last names. They are the guys that dug around in this trash dump in Egypt and carted all these boxes of papyri back to Oxford, many of which are still awaiting publication. I mean, many have been published, but there are still loads waiting for publication. So this is a copy of a little scrap of Revelation. Let's see, they're dating it to the 4th century. We might be able to take a look at it. Let's see. Do they give us pictures of this one?
Not yet.
I don't see any pictures. No, not much there. But we can go to another one. Let's go to, I don't know, 013 from the 9th century and see if we can get pictures that one. Yeah, there are pictures of this majuscule, so you can click on it and see. No transcription this time, but you can zoom in to it and take a closer look. All right, so that's the majuscules. I'm not sure of a good way of searching for minuscules. Like I say, they are as far as the number goes, they're manuscripts that do not begin with a zero. So that means they might begin with a, well, I think it means they might begin with a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So the only way I would know to do it is just to type in a 1 and then see what we got, and then type in a 2 and just sort of add all those things together. looks like there's going to be a lot because it's taken it a while to return anything. 1116 begin with a 1, and that includes Codex 1, Codex 10, Codex 100, probably Codex 1000, and everything in between. So so again, you can take a look at just information about it. This one, Codex 1, they say is from the 12th century, and you can see what the content is. EAP, they say. So E, that's Gospels. Acts is the A, and then the P stands for Paul. So what do we not have? We don't have, I guess we don't have the general epistles, and we don't have Revelation. Honestly, I'm not sure if we have the general epistles or not. I think the A sometimes stands for Acts with the general epistles. So I think that's right. So the general epistles might be included in this one as well. But again, listeners can go through each of them themselves and just see what all they contain. And these get pretty late. We can see some that are pretty specific on the date. This one dates to 1364. So that what you got to assume there is that the manuscript actually has a date written on it, that the scribe wrote the date down. 1444, 1087. These are dated to 1326, but most of them are just dated to a century. All right, maybe that's enough for today. I think next time we can go through and look at especially some of the earlier manuscripts and just take a look at what they look like. And especially when you do that, you can see, well, that 5,300 number, or whatever number we're going to say, is the number of manuscripts that we have for the New Testament. Again, it can be misleading if you're not thinking about it in the right way, because even when you say that we have, 2,000 copies of the Gospel of Matthew, when you actually look at some of these copies, it's like, oh, that's not much. I mean, what did we see? One of the papyrus, it was P1, right? Was a copy of the Gospel of Matthew that was, a bit of Matthew chapter 1 is what you actually have. And so, taking a look at the manuscripts just helps dispel some misconceptions that might exist in our mind about what the evidence is that we have. And then once we do that and we're taking a look at manuscripts, we'll take a look at some of the more important manuscripts, and then we'll start talking about textual variants when the text of these manuscripts disagrees with one another, and how to think through that.
At some point, will we, you kind of touched on it just a little bit when you talked about majority text. Will we discuss any of like majority text and Textus Receptus?
Yeah, I mean,
Then,
we might talk about some big picture textual theories. I think that also will come out when we talk about individual variants, like how to think through this variant. You've got 2,000 manuscripts that say this. You've got, 4 manuscripts that say that. Does that settle the issue, or do we have to look at the actual 4 and see, are they more valuable than those 2,000, and why would we think that they are more valuable?
I guess
So some of that will come out in those sorts of discussions.
some of what I'm wondering is how does this play out in, do different translation committees take different theories?
Oh yeah.
This
Well, let me
process?
think about that. As far as I know, I mean, as far as I know, the only recent major translation that people at my church actually use that takes sort of a non-predominant textual position is the New King James. So like listeners can, if you've got a copy of the New King James, you can just open it up and read the preface, and they are very explicit about the textual theory that they're working with here. They don't call it the majority text. They call it something else. I think like NU or something like that. I forget exactly what their abbreviations are, but it's basically the major what they're sort of trying to do is like ground, they want to, more or less reproduce the King James, but update the language, but then also ground the Greek text being translated in some sort of actual workable theory. And so they talk about that in the preface. It is not the predominant theory that is used by textual critics of the New Testament. So the predominant theory would be that, again, that the earlier manuscripts are going to count more than the later manuscripts. And pretty much, I think all of the English translations that I know about sort of take that predominant theory as their starting point, except for the New King James. It doesn't. There's probably another translation out there, but it just would not be as prominent as the New King James is. That's one that like people at church actually use, and they don't necessarily know what the textual theory is behind it, but
Right. All right. Well, I'm sure we'll dive into that more and more just here and there, as you said. So, anything else you want to add today before we're...
No, I think that'll cover it today.
All right. We want to remind you that episodes are released each and every Wednesday. You can find them on our website at thelightnetwork.tv. Social media platforms, you can follow the Light Network and it will alert you to releases. Podcasting platforms, you can follow or subscribe and you can receive each new episode as it is released into your particular platform. You can, of course, email us at scholars@thelightnetwork.tv. When it comes to questions about textual criticism, I'm probably not going to be the guy that answers you. I'll be the guy that forwards it on. But anyway, it's an important subject. Obviously, we're discussing it, and so we want to interact and help if we can. And most of all, we're grateful you were with us today, and hope that you'll be with us next week as we go back inside the Scholar's Study.